Managing risk in transport and international trade. Okay, what do we do? Well, one of my mentors, who used to be the risk manager for SAF Marine some time ago, said to me, there are three ways we manage risk. We don't go into business and we ignore it. We manage it through contract, which is what I'm going to deal with today, or we take out insurance. Okay, and I think we're going to have somebody else, Francine Hutting, will touch on that. Okay, so I'm not going to deal with insurance. I'm also not going to deal with ignoring risk, although I know a lot of people do. I've had a lot of clients who come to you when they're in trouble, and they say, look, I'm in this trouble, what's happened? I said, well, have you done a risk assessment of, of your contractual position? What are your terms and conditions? How have you been doing business for the last year? No, I've just been doing business, Nothing's gone wrong previously, so why should I change? More importantly, why should I spend money on lawyers to come and tell me what's wrong and then try and fix it through contracts? Just, it's an expense. Unfortunately, as my wise colleague also said, the only time you need insurance is when you don't have it. So the only time you need standard trading conditions, or you need to know what your contractual position is, or you need a right of recourse, is when you don't have it. So I'm going to deal with standard trading conditions. I'm sorry, it is going to be rather dry and boring, but I think it's necessary, and it's going to be very basic, because people forget the basics. Okay? And if you don't pay attention to the basics, that's when you get into trouble. Okay? I will look at transport documents and how they affect your lives and business, and what documents you should use, because people generate these documents and they don't really understand the implications of using certain documents in certain circumstances. So let's start with your standard trading conditions. Okay? Standard trading conditions printed at the back of your transport documents, bills of lading. If you're a freight forwarder, everybody will subscribe to South African Association of Freight Forwarders conditions. I mean, if you unpack those conditions at the back of a bill of lading, which I think can be 24 to 30 clauses, actually prints out, if you do usual 12 font, to between 35 and 40 A4 pages. Okay? Yeah. Have you ever really started, have you tried to read every provision and understand it? Yeah? I understand why people don't want to do that. I understand also why it's then very easy for people to say, well, as one of my other clients said is, well, I just borrowed from his, he was using it, he's in the similar or the same industry, so I'll use it. It doesn't really work that way. You've actually got to pay attention to what you're doing. Okay. So what are they? Okay. Well, nothing special about them. Standard contractual terms. Okay. They are, you can't read that, unfortunately. It says, I'm a man of few words. It says, maybe if you read more, you would have a larger vocabulary. So true. Okay? So, lots of people say to me, that's fine, I'm protected by my standard trading conditions. Somebody's coming to me with a claim, right? And I say, okay, can you show me where they're or how they were incorporated in your contract? I say, well, here's my invoice. Okay, see, at the very bold it says, terms and conditions apply. So, well, that's too late. Why? Well, you actually got to incorporate these terms at the time you contract. Okay? Now, how many people here do business via email or telephone, book or take cargo like that? I've seen it a lot, And, emails written or have a phone call followed up by an email. Okay? It's important to get these terms and conditions in when your contract is concluded. Okay? When is a contract concluded? Sorry, legal jargon, unconditional acceptance of an offer containing all the essential terms. So when we're dealing with transport, what are those essential terms? Well, I'm going to carry your cargo from A to B. That's what the carrier does. And you're going to pay me for it. Okay? So you have an exchange of email. Can you take my cargo from South Africa to China? Yes, there's my freight rate. That's it, done, dusted, right? If at that stage you don't have, by the way, I'm taking it subject to the following conditions. Or, if you're a freight forwarder and you're dealing with a customer, you say, by the way, when I'm doing this business for you, just be aware that I've got 40 pages of terms and conditions which apply. So you've actually got to have it right up front. And you can't have it, I've seen it in emails. You say, no, it's in my email. When I email, there it is. And right below your signature page in the finest print is standard terms and conditions apply. It's not good enough in our law. In our law, you can't hide away from these things. People try and hide away because people don't want people to read their standard terms and conditions, because if you look at them, they disavow responsibility for practically everything. So I'll do the work for you, but if something goes wrong, sorry, don't look to me. Or if something goes wrong, I'll pay you 10 cents in the rand, okay? But, you're not the only person out there who does business like that. There's a reason you do business like that. It's because if you don't limit your liability somehow, you're not going to get insurance, or insurance is going to be very expensive. And that's the other thing you've got to bear in mind. When you do business and you go and you buy insurance, then every underwriter is going to want to look at your trading conditions, and that's the basis on which they provide you with cover. If you don't incorporate your terms and conditions in your contract, and I'm going to try and give you some practical examples at the end to try and tie all this theoretical mumbo-jumbo in, but if you don't contract in terms of your standard trading conditions, you may have paid for insurance, but they won't pay out your claim. Okay. So how are we restricted by standard trading conditions? Well, South Africa, you've got this wonderful thing which we've inherited called freedom of contract. I can contract out of basically anything except willful actions, okay? And of course the Consumer Protection Act comes and does a whole lot of things, but I think in shipping and logistics, the Consumer Protection Act really plays a role, because most of us deal with people whose turnover is more than the threshold, which I think, and I'm sorry, I'm a shipping lawyer, not a consumer protection lawyer, but I think it's about R1 million now. Might have gone up to 2 million. Common law restrictions I've mentioned, can't contract out of willful acts. And then, of course, you've got international conventions. And, of course, in South Africa, we don't have road or rail conventions, but we do have, when we're shipping stuff, the Hague and Hague-Visby rules, which exclude, to a certain extent, an ocean carrier's liability, or they limit an ocean carrier's liability. Okay. Right, so let's move on to transport documents, but before we get there, let's have a look at most cargo is moved through freight forwarders, okay? Most people don't go to shipping lines directly unless they're really big, okay? How many people are in the freight forwarding industry here? Okay, good, quite a few, great. So this will be relevant, okay? So what's the first thing that appears in the standard terms and conditions freight forwarder? Usually somewhere up front says, when I'm dealing with you, my customer, and the customers also will be aware, I can act as a principal or an agent. Okay? What does it mean? Okay? The principal, if I'm acting as a principal, it means the buck stops with me. Okay? So if something goes wrong, you look to me as the person who you contracted with. Okay? I have a little diagram which hopefully explains that. Okay? If you're an agent, you pass the buck. Right? So you're just an intermediary. Okay? So your customer comes to you and says, my container was dropped, my electronic TV sets, which Clive talked about, which nobody's purchasing anymore, are now, shattered. You say, I'm terribly sorry, but go see, I'm sorry, I always try and use go and see MSC, or go see K-Line, I know the K-Line people, go see Maersk. Don't come speak to me, because I was just contracting on your behalf, or I was arranging this on your behalf, okay? So, if you are a principal, or if the person you're dealing with is the principal, then that's who you will go to. The forwarder then is the one who is responsible to its customer, and it has subcontracted to the shipping lines. Whereas if they're an agent and a buck passer, it's a bad term to use, but they will only be an intermediary. Okay. Please, one thing I forgot to mention is if you have any questions or you want to take this in a different direction, please interrupt me now. I find it better if people interact now and ask questions and at the end and try and remember them. Okay? Right. So, under a contract of affreightment, what are the risks and liabilities? So the carrier will take your cargo, or take somebody's cargo, and take it from A to B, and they'll be responsible for, well, to a limited extent, if you read the back of a bill of lading, for loss or damage. The merchant who contracts pays freight, makes declaration of what's in the container, the weight of the container, very important nowadays. We're carrying dangerous goods, and they'll be responsible for paying other charges like detention and demurrage. Okay, now do you want to be a shipper? So if you're doing the business of a freight forwarder, do I want to be a shipper as far as the ocean carrier is concerned, or do I want to pass the buck? Okay. One container of calcium hypochlorate, pool chemicals. And that question in part is answered by, well, who am I dealing with? Does my customer have, if I'm a freight forwarder, the necessary wherewithal or insurance to, if he gives me incorrect information and I pass it on to the shipping line, because as far as the shipping line is concerned, I'm going to be responsible. But if I'm just acting as an agent, well, then it's my customer's problem. Okay, back to that. All right. So how's this all, the standard terms and conditions, all these exemptions, how do they play themselves out in the shipping industry? Everybody seen that? Standard bill of lading. Okay, that's just the front. As I said, on the back, printed out, and there are 35 pages of conditions. Okay, that is importantly not always the contract. And I'll explain why a bit later, but there are a number of functions for that document, the bill of lading, which you get. Okay? Tells you what goods the carrier has received. Okay? And it is evidence of the contract of carriage. I say evidence, my professor at university when I was doing shipping law a long time ago drummed this into us. He said, everybody accepts that the bill of lading seems to be the contract of carriage, but you've actually got to go behind that, because this document is produced even only after the goods are shipped. If you recall, our contract is concluded way before then. Okay? And the importance of this hopefully will register when I come to the example at the end. Okay? It entitles the holder of the goods to possession. Okay? It doesn't, everybody says, oh, bill of lading is a document of title. It isn't. Okay? Issues of title are dealt with by sale contracts, not by the bill of lading. What it does, though, it does give right to possession. And now this is very important in trade, because where you're financing purchase of goods by means of letter of credit, the banks, who've got lots of money, I understand, will want some sort of security over the goods before they make payment. So, okay, in those circumstances, it's important that you choose a document which is going to give the bank the comfort of the security in having the right to go to the shipping line and say, whilst I hold this document, and I've got nothing to do with the sale contract whatsoever, I'm not the purchaser or the seller, I'm just an intermediary who's financed this transaction, I can hold this document, okay, as security for those goods. And then, importantly, right, it transfers rights and obligations, including title to sue. Okay? Why is that important? We'll find out later as well with a practical example. But, well, let me just move on, I think, to a seaway bill, and then we'll get to why it's important to know what document to use in relation to title to sue. Okay? Seaway bill, okay? Sorry, go back one step. The problem with a bill of lading, of course, okay, is that you have to have it at the port of discharge when you get there, because it's a fundamental requirement in shipping that the carrier is not going to release those goods to you unless you produce that bill of lading. Because if you don't have that, or you don't, and they release the goods, okay, and somebody else comes along, and it's happened before, right, says, hey, by the way, where are my goods? You say, well, I released it to Joe Bloggs. I'm sure he was the person I was entitled to release to. Then the carrier is liable without reserve. Okay? There's no defense to that claim. And their P&I club is not going to cover them for that loss. So in trade today, it's often very difficult to get that document, which is only printed or audited after the goods are loaded on board the vessel, through to the shipper, through banking channels, to the receiver, when vessels are traveling so quickly with such volumes of cargo between ports. Okay? So what happened then is people thought, well, let's develop a document which doesn't require it to be handed over to the carrier at the port of discharge. Okay? So we don't have this problem. And that's what that's the seaway bill. So it acts as a receipt of good. It's evidence of the contract of carriage, but it doesn't pass rights or obligations. Okay? And why is this important? Okay, so rights, one of those rights and obligations is title to sue. What lawyers like is that means we can recover, but it's also what your insurance companies want. Okay? Because when they pay you out on a claim, they're going to want to know that they've got a right to go and recover what they've paid you. So in terms of our law and many jurisdictions in the world, okay, when a bill of lading is transferred, certain obligations and rights go with it, including title to sue. But a seaway bill, no. Okay? A seaway bill doesn't transfer rights and obligations. So in terms of South African law, okay, the shipper on a seaway bill is the only person who has title to sue. Okay? But in English law, it's the consignee. Okay, so it's all very dry and you're wondering why this is important. So I'm hoping, let's interject with an example. I have a client who exports large quantities of fruit from South Africa. And they sell this fruit on a consignment basis. And we'll deal a bit with Incoterms later. But what that means is that when the fruit gets into the States, they have contracted with their receivers over there who go into the market and they sell the goods. And they get a percentage of the profit back. But those receivers don't take responsibility for the goods until such time as they are landed in America, get to their warehouse. Okay? So the farmers in South Africa have risk and title. You know, it's their cargo all the way through to when it finally gets to the market in America. So as a standard practice, their shipping line issued them with bills of lading. They passed those bills of lading on to their customers in America. Cargo gets there, and it is fruit juice. It's no longer fruit. the temperature on the reefers hasn't been set correctly, and they can't sell it. Okay? Or they can sell it for a very reduced amount. Okay? And now we have to go and sue somebody for that, the shipping line, unfortunately, under the bill of lading. But we don't have the bill of lading because we've passed it on to the receivers in America so they can get delivery of the goods. They're the consignees. But the receivers in America are not the people who've suffered the loss, because they only take risk once the goods get to destination and are sold. Okay? So you have this difficulty here where you have provided, you've transferred your rights to sue when you shouldn't do. Okay? Now, how would you correct that? Well, luckily for us in England, you can sue in a representative action, but to be on the safe side, perhaps you should use a seaway bill, okay, where the shipper retains title. But it's not that simple, because if you're going into another country which doesn't have the same law as us, that the shipper retains title to sue and the rights, it might be going to a place which exercises law on English jurisdiction, then you lose that right again. The long and the short of it is, it's important to know where you're trading to, what law applies, and in the context of your trade, what documents you should be using and issuing. Okay? It's important to know when you're advising your customer as well, because freight forwarders will issue their own, as we will see, NVOCC bills. Okay, so let's get back to that. So we've all seen, okay, this is the ocean bill, okay, issued by the shipping line to its customer. Okay. Its customer could be, if your freight forwarder is acting as an agent, the actual owner of or shipper of the cargo, or if the freight forwarder is acting as a principal, the shipping line, as far as it's concerned, it's the freight forwarder who's its customer. So what's going to be recorded on this bill of lading, or should be, if you are acting as a principal, is your details, not your customers. Okay? Because the freight forwarder will issue its own house bill, or NVO, what we call non-vessel owning common carrier, or NVOCC bill. Okay? And this is the bill of lading which gets handed over to the customer. Okay? And so when you are issuing your documents or your house bill to the customer, it's also important to know is, what type of document must I issue to my customer? Am I going to issue a bill of lading? Am I going to issue a seaway bill? It's important to know what your customer's business is. Okay. So why is it important to have this? Okay? Because you want to know what your contractual terms are. Okay? And you want to know that if something goes wrong, you have a right of recovery. Okay. I'm just going to deal with Incoterms briefly, because there is a fallacy or myth that these are freight terms. I've seen people say, quote, freights, freight rates, ex-CIF or ex-CPT. But Incoterms are sale terms. Okay? How they're important in relation to transport businesses, because they delineate for the seller or the shipper of the goods what type of, or what he is responsible for in relation to the carriage of the goods. Okay? So as you move from X works all the way down to your delivered terms, the obligation of the seller or shipper increases. Okay? So in X works, the seller says, well, to his buyer, come collect my goods. But in a delivered contract, DDP at the bottom, the seller has to arrange carriage all the way to the port of discharge where the buyer is, and sometimes to an intermediary storage facility, or even sometimes to the buyer's premises. And this becomes important in relation to, as we will see, what transport document should be used depending on what your sale terms are. Because as your obligation to provide carriage increases, right, transport, so does the risk, because the seller then will assume risk of loss or damage to the goods, okay, all the way through to the port of discharge if he is contracting on delivered terms. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll through this quickly because what I really want to discuss is 2 or 3 cases that I had fairly recently. My customer was a freight forwarder. He arranges importation of goods for his customer in South Africa from China. He goes through to my client, and my client says, can you arrange these goods, transport these goods? And he says, no, I can do that. Because I have a steady flow of volume of cargo with a shipping line, I can get you a good preferential rate. Okay? So what my client does is he goes through to his agent in China and says, look, my customer is importing these television sets. This is the shipper of those television sets. They must be loaded on board X shipping lines. They must be shipped, with this shipping line. And he quotes in that regard a contract number he has with the shipping line because that's where he's gained that preferential rate. The agent in China does what he's told, and he earns a $50 fee for the pleasure of booking the cargo. And then when the TV sets get here, they're not in very good condition. Okay? And customer says, well, who's responsible for this? I say, well, were you acting as an agent or a principal? He looks at me and says, well, I don't know. I said, well, can I see the transport documents which were issued? So he gives me the shipping line's bill of lading, and on the shipping line's bill of lading, my client's name appears as the shipper and consignee. So I go, great, fantastic, right? Where's your house bill of lading? So he looks at me, says, oh, you mean what my Chinese agent issued? I said, yes, hopefully your house bill. No, the bill of lading which is presented in this case was the Chinese agent's bill of lading. Okay? Nowhere does it mention my customer or my client, right, in those circumstances. And that is the bill of lading which was used to import the goods and clear the goods into South Africa. And I say, well, why did you do this in circumstances where you are telling me that you are accepting freight and acting as a principal? He says, no, well, because if my Chinese agent issues their bill and they're quite happy to do so, I don't have any risk. Because my customer will, he's got to go to China. It's great. It's fantastic for me. I said, well, unfortunately, there's a rather dogged and fairly clever lawyer on the other side for your customer who's come through and said, I don't know who this Chinese person is. Okay? I didn't contract with him. Why are you giving me this document? Okay? I said, my customer, I think you've got a problem, because if you look at the email exchanges, it was you who he contracted with. At the end of the day then, okay, my customer had to pay out for those television sets. Okay? It wasn't protected by standard trading conditions, okay, because he couldn't rely on the Chinese guys' standard trading conditions. and didn't get paid by his underwriters because they said he didn't contract on his standard trading conditions. He didn't issue his house bill as he was supposed to do. Okay? Another example of why it's important that you get it right. Different client freight forward, and it seems to be a trend that when goods come from China, people like using their Chinese agent's bill of lading. Also, it wasn't television sets this time, it was cosmetics. Arrived in South Africa, nothing wrong with them, okay? But for some reason, my client's customer decided he didn't need the goods. So he left them in storage. It's what you do, you know, for a year. Didn't bother to collect them. There was, of course, a whole lot of banter as between the shipping line and my client and his customer as to why he wasn't doing this, and you know. And every month the shipping line would send a bill for detention and demurrage. Okay. Now, how much was that at the end of the day? Well, it was over R1 million. Okay. So, and my customer was kept going. My client, sorry, I keep calling customers, keep going. Well, speak to the receiver. You know, he must damn well deal with this. And when they came to me, it was 9-10 months down the line. I said, look, unfortunately, your name's the one on the bill of lading, yeah. Right? No. Were you acting as a principal or an agent? No, you know, same story, contracted with, got a great rate with the shipping line, you're a principal. Okay. Where's your bill of lading? Right? Because we want to now go to your customer and say, in the same way that the shipping line is coming to you and saying, can I have R1 million, please, for detention and demurrage? Let's see what your bill of lading says about detention and demurrage. Oh, here's my bill of lading. Another Chinese agent. And this is where, unfortunately, I mean, let's face it, lawyers like it messy because it becomes expensive then for us to try and sort the problem out. Because then we have to try and determine, well, what is your contract with your customer? Because you don't have a contract which clearly says, like the shipping line, I'm entitled to recover my demurrage and detention charges. So you have to use implied or tacit terms, okay? And you have to tell your client that, although the claim you're facing is probably rock solid, your recovery is uncertain. And then you have to spend money on litigation, and that is very, very expensive. Okay? So, it is, and then, of course, right, once again, you know, if you've got a credit risk insurance, as the guys did, your credit underwriters are only going to pay out if it's not a disputed claim, right, or you get a judgment. Now, of course, the receiver on this end kicked and screamed and put up a defense, said, well, you know, the Customs and Excise Act says that you can only keep goods for, you know, 30 days, I think it was, or in, you know, if it was a containerized cargo, and then it's got to move to a state's warehouse, and so they should have unpacked the container, and so these demurrage and detention charges should never have accrued. So we were met with a defense. So, long and the short of it is my client had to go to the shipping line, who was somewhat understanding and gave him a reduced cost, you know, but from $1 million to whatever it was. And he's not able to recover that from his customer because he didn't know what didn't pay attention to the contractual matrix and ensure that the correct documentation was in place. So, when the container ends up in the beach, all right, as one of my colleagues always says, make sure that when the music stops, you've got a chair. Okay. Now, I know that was very dry, so I have to end off with some shipping humor. And apologies to Michael Heads. I did phone him and ask him if he was going to use this clip. Just to wake you up again. The sound working.
Senator Collins, thanks for coming in.
It's a great pleasure, thank you.
This ship that was involved in the incident off Western Australia this week...
Yeah, the one the front fell off?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not very typical. I'd like to make that point.
Well, how is it untypical?
Well, there are a lot of these ships going around the world all the time, and very seldom does anything like this happen. I just don't want people thinking that tankers aren't safe.
Was this tanker safe?
Well, I was thinking more about the other ones.
The ones that are safe?
Yeah, the ones the front doesn't fall off.
Well, if this wasn't safe, why did it have 80,000 tonnes of oil on it?
Well, I'm not saying it wasn't safe. It's just perhaps not quite as safe as some of the other ones.
Why?
Well, some of them are built so the front doesn't fall off at all.
Well, wasn't this built so the front wouldn't fall off?
Well, obviously not.
How do you know?
Well, because the front fell off and 20,000 tonnes of crude oil spilled into the sea caught fire. It's a bit of a giveaway. I'd just like to make the point that that is not normal.
Well, what sort of standards are these oil tankers built to?
Oh, very rigorous maritime engineering standards.
What sort of thing?
Well, the front's not supposed to fall off for a start.
And what other things?
Well, there are regulations governing the materials that they can be made of.
What materials?
Well, cardboard's out.
And?
No cardboard derivatives.
Like paper?
No paper. No string, no sellotape.
Rubber?
No, rubber's out. They've got to have a steering wheel. There's a minimum crew requirement.
What's the minimum crew?
Oh, one, I suppose.
So the allegations that they're just designed to carry as much oil as possible, how are the consequences? I mean, that's ludicrous.
Absolutely ludicrous. These are very, very strong vessels.
So what happened in this case?
Well, the front fell off in this case, by all means, but it's very unusual.
But Senator Collins, why did the front book fall off?
Well, a wave hit it.
A wave hit it?
A wave hit the ship.
Is that unusual?
Oh, yeah. At sea, chance of a million.
So what do you do to protect the environment in cases like this?
The ship was towed outside the environment.
Into another environment?
No. It's been towed beyond the environment. It's not in the environment.
No, but from one environment to another environment.
No, it's beyond the environment. It's not in an environment. It has been towed beyond the environment.
Well, what's out there?
Nothing's out there.
Well, there must be something out there.
There is nothing out there. All there is sea and birds and fish.
And?
And 20,000 tonnes of crude oil.
And what else?
And a fire.
And anything else?
And the part of the ship that the front fell off. But there's nothing else out there.
Senator Collins, thanks for joining us.
A complete void.
Yeah, we're out of time.
The environment's perfectly safe. We're out of time?
True. Sorry. Now that you're all awake again, are there any questions?